Hey, hello, happy Friday. Please excuse any morning light that's filtering in, any bumps that you notice in my ponytail because those are inevitable. It's supposed to be over 100 degrees today, so we are filming before work today to try and beat the heat because we really need to talk about Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame, Adjei-Brenyah. And of course, on a day where it's supposed to be very hot and kind of insufferable, we have the most to dig into here. I am not going to touch on even a fraction of what this book is exploring, but we're gonna try to dip our toes into the well here. So first things first, this has been a pretty buzzy book this year, at least to my purview, and that may just be because I would already be interested in this book. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, Melody, you have gone on so many tangents about how you are not drawn to dystopias, and this is a dystopia. It is about prisoners being forced to fight gladiator style to the death in order to win the dream of freedom. And listen, normally there might be a little bit more buy-in from me for that. However, I read Friday Black years ago. And Friday Black is my favorite kind of short stories. Weird, insightful, sharp. And so, like with Mariana Enriquez earlier this year, I was very interested to see how this voice that I love so much in short form storytelling translates to a novel. And I think that the way that that works in this novel is so interesting because, like when I talk about how you can tell if someone, or I think you can tell if someone has a poetic background within their tone and their language, I think here in terms of the structure, you can really see the sharp short story skills and instincts. Because while this is a novel forwarding a main storyline, it utilizes these kind of disparate little chapters to kind of pop us around the world. And so we have our main storyline that we're popping in and out of with primarily Thurwar, who we meet at the beginning of the book. She becomes a champion after the person she is put against in her first fight basically gives up her life to Thurwar and sacrifices herself because she no longer wants to be a part of this system. And we pick back up with Thurwar when she is the Grand Colossal. So there are all these different ranks. No, I will not be able to recite those ranks off to you, but she is basically 2 fights away from freedom when we pick back up with her. And she has a group, her chain, that is basically like her team in this environment of extreme action sports, as they've labeled it, to kind of sanitize what this really is. I'm going to put this book down. And so we pick back up with her, but we are actually introduced first to Stax, who is another high-ranking competitor champion who is a colossal. So she is basically about 1 fight away from Grand Colossal herself, and she is in a relationship with Thurwar. So there is a lot at stake for them, and there is a lot of buy-in and interest from audiences for their story. They're interested in them as fighters, as athletes in this world, and then they are also interested in their personal lives, because in this world, everything around these games is basically live streamed. So it's a little bit Big Brothery, and it's this idea of not having any autonomy, any privacy. You are still at the mercy of a system in so many ways. And so obviously this book is an exploration and an indictment of the American prison system. And it does that by really kind of heightening everything. And the thing I found interesting about the heightening, we are in this kind of like sci-fi dystopia setting. However, what I found really impactful about it as well is that it doesn't feel too far off. And one of the ways that this is cemented through the work itself is that we have these chapters, we're being immersed in this story, and then we will get little footnotes that, one, either remind us of the story or the humanity of the character, the prisoner that's being explored at that time within this unjust system, though we will circle back to this book's exploration of justice, and I'm not going to get on any soapboxes there necessarily or have any answers or solutions, because it is a complex question, and that is one of the things that this book is exploring as well. But I think this idea of prisoners being forced to the death is this extreme example, but how extreme? So these footnotes are rooting us either in the humanity of these people, or it is rooting us in the reality of this world, in the sense that we are tracing the kind of sci-fi of this world, the tech of this world that maybe doesn't exist in that full form yet here, at least to my knowledge, but I don't have security clearance to know what kind of like weapons are being developed on the back end. And so we'll have these footnotes that basically root us in history or prior events or parts of our constitution or our political system that make these things possible, make these horrors possible. And so it really doesn't allow us to look away. It doesn't say this is an extreme example. It says this is the path that we are on, and this is also our history. And I think that that's really important too, because it is easy to want to divorce yourself from the idea of violence or think that we are above this kind of violence. I know I personally would like to believe that. I'm not like throwing stones here. However, that's just not the reality. I think we go back to the really common discourse we have, especially in America, that we have these really puritanical views on sex and intimacy, but at the same time, we really crave and glorify violence in a lot of ways, and the way that that is tied to patriarchal structures as well. The book does not get into that from a didactic point of view, but I definitely think that that is explored, especially in the fact that the two women we are following most closely are the biggest champions. They are who everyone is rooting for. They're who we see these spectators basically frothing at the mouth over, and yet in many ways we also see them sexualized. And while they are able to claim their own relationships within their bubble, there is still this wider picture. However, going back to this idea of we are not as far from this violence as we would like to think, one, just the climate within the last however many years, right? You can feel it kind of bubbling and percolating, but also just where the inspiration for this book comes from in some ways, and not in this instance the current prison system completely, but the Roman gladiator inspiration of it all. And I have not been following a lot of the reviews of this book. I saw a lot of the buzz leading up, but I wanted to go in as fresh as I could. So I could see a lot of people making Hunger Games comparisons, although that is not a perfect comparison by any means. But I think in the current landscape, anytime you have these like battles to the death, that is where people's brains are gonna go. However, it is very rooted in this gladiator system. I have not seen the movie Gladiator. Yell at me about it in the comments, I know. But I have taken a basic theater history class. Because fun fact, you have to earn a theater degree, and we talked about Roman theater in theater history. Now, I did not try to revive my old MacBook that all of my college notes live on, nor did I go hunting for where I may have backed them up other places, but I did do a little bit of Googling to confirm what I remember. Mostly because I think it's pretty well known that gladiators were like prisoners that were being forced to fight to the death for the entertainment of the masses. However, Romans really did this idea of punitive entertainment on a large scale. They would like flood venues and stage these elaborate naval battles with prisoners where they were fighting to the death. This kind of blood sport was very common. And again, there seems to be this narrative, or there wants to be this idea that we have come so far from that, but that is just not the case. And especially when we start looking at like the racial dynamics of this, and when the racial dynamics of the prison system are really explored in a really nuanced and restrained way, I think in this as well, we think back to things that aren't too far in our past in terms of violence against Black bodies that stay in our current, in our present. I also want to say, I think that the way that violence and action, if you want to call it that, were handled in the narrative was really well done. That was one of the pieces I was the most unsure about as a reader based on my own reading preferences and tastes, because I am someone that kind of checks out during action-heavy sequences very easily. And that's true for both prose and visual mediums. I am not someone that gravitates toward action movies where it's mostly action sequences. I get bored. And I know that there are lots of variation of storytelling and that plot can be forwarded through action in the same way that plot and relationships are forwarded through intimacy and romance. However, I personally can find that harder to track, and also my brain just sometimes has trouble tracking, at least in written action, the maneuverings. And even in this book, I did have to go back sometimes to reread some sections to figure out kind of the logistics of what had moved moved where in terms of weapons and bodies and where we were maneuvering. However, I also was worried that the violence would be gratuitous here, and gratuitous in the sense of a lot and it being violent, and of course it is in many ways, but it also wasn't the entirety of the narrative. I thought that the portrayal of the violence was actually pretty reserved, and I think that that was incredibly purposeful, and where we saw the action, where we saw the violence was incredibly purposeful, because the whole book is a critique on that violence. So it makes sense that we aren't going to dwell in it too much, or that when we do dwell in it, it is incredibly intentional, especially because there is that risk as well of being desensitized to the violence itself. And so I'm not going to pretend that this book wasn't violent, that there wasn't violence here by any means. That is the central crux of what is being explored, but rather that it didn't feel like it was taking up page space, that it was kind of spinning the wheel of the narrative. It was always forwarding these characters, forwarding the plot, forwarding the world, or establishing us in the brutality of the world, in the real dissonance of seeing this brutality against like the showmanship of the announcer and the commentary on these people and these spaces. So I don't know that I have a whole lot to intelligently unpack here, but I think that it would be disingenuous to not mention the action and the violence, because that is really at the heart of a lot of things here, but also the kind of juxtaposition of the violence, that these people's lives have been so violent that they're forced into this violence, this continuation of violence, what that continuation of violence means for the idea of rehabilitation and the sense of justice, but then also then the commentary there as well. And we see both the skill and the luck involved, in the sense that when these links are new to the arena, they spin for a weapon and their fate is largely decided by what weapon they receive. We see Thurwar enter the ring the first time in the prologue with, I believe it was a corkscrew, a singular corkscrew, but we see someone later get a spoon and the kind of devastation of that. But that idea of control and autonomy being a lie, and this whole system kind of being built on a lie, because we also see within the world this idea that there is one person who has been freed by this system, but also the knowledge that the game makers kind of ushered them through that process so that they could hold them up as an example and proof that you can be freed through this system, but the knowledge that everyone within the system has that it's kind of a doomed process, even as they are fighting for their lives every day. And another way that this world is really exploring the desensitization to violence that we have is the fact that we see in a scene later in the book where a bunch of people are basically paying to meet these fighters, these prisoners, these champions, these links, according to the book. I know that there is a lot of terminology that can be used there, and none of it feels quite right. None of it feels like it encapsulates the whole idea, because there are so many ideas being explored here. However, there is this basically meet and greet opportunity, and we see children in that space. And having grown up in the 90s, I remember a lot of my friends being really, really into wrestling growing up. I was a kid. I, one, was not allowed to watch wrestling. I also wasn't allowed to watch MTV, and I'm not still bitter about it. It's fine. I guess it kind of makes sense from a parenting point of view. But two, because I was a child, I had no sense that that environment was fake, that it was make-believe, that it was all staged. And so we really are exploring this idea of entertainment and what is real and what is fake. And so we also then have this kind of reality TV bend to this, where the ethics of reality TV are already very questionable, and we're seeing a lot of the fallout of that play out right now. But then we add on this idea of talent, for lack of a better word, prisoners that are completely captive to this system. And we watch a couple of these links getting signed into the system and what that looks like, because there is a lot of why do you enter this system, because they have to sign in, they have to agree. So there is still some kind of smoke and mirrors semblance or attempt to portray this free will, this informed consent, but they are told that their odds of survival are very slim, or they know their odds of survival are very slim, but they are told if they survive, they will be freed. And some of the given circumstances that we're circling back to at the real start of where this story begins is that the previous Grand Colossal that was on the same link as Thurwar and Stax has just died. And not just died, but been killed before his last fight, where he would gain freedom. And this man was, from all accounts that we can see in the narrative, pretty well liked amongst his peers. He was convicted of a very violent crime, and that definitely circles into this exploration of what happened to him. And that then circles into this exploration of what justice looks like, because amidst all of this, we do have a group of protesters that are gaining momentum throughout the course of the book. So we have these kind of side plots, side quests that are giving us a more complete look at this world. So we're following these links, these fighters, these prisoners in a couple of different chains. And then we are also following a resistance group, and we are following a couple that are extreme fans of high action sports, and the way that these groups kind of circle in and out of even our main plot lines I find really interesting. We see our couple appear in some fan mail that Thurwar is reading in a really smart way, and a way that really illuminates the characters. And I think that the short story instincts are so evident, especially in those sections, because there is so much communicated in such a succinct small amount of space about these people and who these people are. And so in following this protest group, we follow a young woman who we find out is the daughter of Sunset Harkless, who was the Link, the Grand Colossal, who was about to be freed and was murdered. And we also find out that while Mari, his daughter, is fighting against the system very voraciously, she doesn't know if she wanted her father to see freedom. She didn't know if she wanted to interact with him on the other side. She just knew that she didn't want him in that system. And so in the course of these protests, at one point she has an interaction with a reporter that is very much a lot of the discourse that we have even today about similar conversations, that basically boils down to, if this system is so wrong, what are you going to do with these really hardened criminals that can't be let back into society? And so we are looking at these people that are fighting with this idea of justice and also rehabilitation and what that looks like. And even the prisoners within this novel are kind of looking at that idea, fighting with that idea. And I was also very aware of how knowledge of the crimes of these competitors impacted my reaction to these characters, which I think is just human in some ways, but I was also very aware of it and tried to be aware of what I thought that was doing in the narrative. And in terms of one thing in particular that I'm going to leave to the end, because it is a huge spoiler, I think it was done so skillfully. But in terms of that exploration, I wrote down in my brand new reading journal that I now have a cover for, that this has nuanced explorations of violence and justice, and what would different systems to rehabilitate violent crime look like, even if we don't have answers. So this idea of getting that thought process going, letting this sit, letting this percolate, and those are the questions, or some of the questions, that this book is interested in exploring. So it's making us think very actively about these things. It's heightening things so that we can pull back and look at the reality of the horrors that are already there and realize where we have started, what already exists, so we can assess, so we can recognize the violence. So there's some emotional attachment there. And it made me very aware, and I think another one of the questions this book was interested in exploring was, what is the distinction between a murderer and someone cheering for state-sanctioned murder? Like, what is it that lets you off the hook in your own conscience, that lets you say, I'm a good person? What's the black and white thinking in this world that makes it easy to turn off and on what you think someone deserves based on their past? And in some ways, removed from the gladiator like style battles of it all, that thinking makes sense because our brains want to be able to understand a complex issue, want to be able to boil down this thing that is hard and uncomfortable and upsetting into good and bad in some way. But then how are we acting? How are we justifying other actions based on that? And what is that line between good and bad? Also, sorry if my pen is making some appearances here. This is clearly a heavy hand talk video because there are a lot of ideas here. I have just mostly hidden my hand so it's not completely distracting. To jump back to the structure again briefly, jumping around, as the narrative kind of does, to form a much bigger picture. We have obviously mentioned the short story instincts in that kind of style of these really succinct chapters that are moving us around the fuller picture of this world. However, I also found it interesting because the narrative is also really focused, obviously, on the kind of entertainment aspect of this world and how little privacy these people have, how everything is part of the show. We see them basically being followed by essentially small drone cameras. We see the way that fans are interacting with this content, watching this content, the way that their houses are hooked up so there's screens in basically every appliance so they never have to miss a moment. And so with that, these chapters also kind of mimic these feeds in some ways because we're getting little different parts of the story. The people that are participating in this world and watching these events are able to move from link to link to watch different parts of the competition, whether it be when they're on the march from event to event, whether it be the lead up to the fight itself, which is of course a pay-per-view situation. And so we are jumping around this world as well. And in addition to that, we are jumping around, and kind of slight spoiler to the maneuvering of this, so be aware, we are also jumping around the timeline in some ways because we have this idea of, oh, you can catch up on this, you can join this world at any time. And so what appears for most of the book to be running on the same timeline, we realize we are getting a kind of accelerated view of the competitors that Thurwar and Stax are going to meet in the arena for this last doubles fight that they are going to participate in, which is Thurwar's second to last fight. And amidst all of this, we are also being teased with this knowledge Thurwar gets about a rule change in the upcoming season. And the season is going to switch over after this last doubles fight. And so it is called like the cruelest option. And I hate that I was able to call that cruelest twist, but also it's not that far off, especially in this world where we've been seeing for the last decades reality TV kind of maneuvered for the most dramatic plot lines. And I'm not going to spoil what that twist is. Well, I will later. It's not super hard to guess, but this idea of the cruelest option being made purely for entertainment value, being made so that the people in the boardroom can make $1. We see that boardroom, we see the nepotism there, we see the insular nature of everything, we see the privilege, and how these cruel decisions are made at the end of the day, not for any sense of justice, but to appease and entertain the masses. And before we circle to the end that I do want to talk about briefly at the end of this video, so I don't spoil anything too much, I also want to talk a little bit about how jumping around within the narrative impacts the characters, because we both get this incredibly intimate knowledge and experience of these characters, and at the same time we are still held a little bit at a distance like those viewing would be. We get to see into some of these private moments where they go into blackout. We get to see into their inner psyche in some instances. It also depends on the character. Some of these characters we're following in third person, some we get in first person. It is interesting because Thurwar and Stax, we get more third person, and their competitors, we get first person, and just the real agility in terms of voice and differentiation of voice that exemplifies, I think is really masterful. And the book makes it look so easy. It's really easy to forget that that's really skilled maneuvering. And so I was really interested in that these felt like fully formed characters that were grappling with really intense and complex questions within their inner lives, struggling to make decisions that they had to make on the fly, in the spur of the moment, these life or death decisions, struggling to realize what community looks like amidst this world that is all death and destruction, and what their part in that world is. And so, like I said, there is a lot of nuance built in here, and it would be easy to say, I think, especially with things like the footnotes, that there is a tendency to be didactic in the book, but I don't think that is accurate, because I actually think every choice pretty incredibly subtly underscores the ideas of the book. And one of the quotes that I think sums up this world and its explorations the best, and follow along in your own copy if you have one, on pages 198 to 199, but the quote says, "I thought of how the world can be anything, and how sad it is that it's this." And this brings us to the end in both the exploration of the central thesis and the subtlety of what this maneuvering really did. So if you do not want this spoiled, thank you so much for hanging out. Like, subscribe, whatever you're feeling on the way out, I don't want to spoil this for you. However, if you do want to talk about this, if you've read this or you just don't care, let's dive into this. So the really brutal rule change that is thrown in season 33 that most of us probably saw coming is that Thorwar's final fight will be against Stacks. And on its face, it's bad enough, right? They are pitting these two women who love each other against each other for freedom, and what the choice of that is, what the violence of that is, what the spectacle of that is. And then when we dig even deeper narratively, it is even more heartbreaking because we have Thorwar, who has been convicted on the death of her girlfriend at the time. And the knowledge is rears that there were other instances of domestic violence from Thorwar against her girlfriend, and this idea that she has since found love with Stacks, who preaches love, who loves Thorwar, and has been incarcerated because she fought back against an attempted sexual assault, an attempted rape. And so in this final fight, in order to achieve freedom, if Thorwar indeed does want to achieve freedom, I'm not going to spoil everything, she would have to kill the woman she loves, the very act that took her freedom away. And then you have Stacks, who preaches love from the arena, being asked to kill the woman she loves. And so there are these complexities and these nuances that are throughout, asking us to really look at the system. And I think it's definitely about acknowledging where we are and also asking questions about how we can envision a better system and what that would look like without telling us that the answers are going to be easy. In fact, ensuring us that this exploration is going to be hard. And so yeah, again, this is but a fraction of what this book is exploring. We didn't even touch on primarily the technology of influencing within this world and how a lot of these actions are being spurred on by the threat of bodily harm, by the threat of violence and pain particularly. And so there are just so many pockets of discussion. It's a buzzy book for a reason. It's skillfully crafted, it's asking important, thoughtful questions, and is entertaining at the same time. And I'm almost hesitant to say entertaining because it feels like we are buying into the same system in some ways that this book is calling out, and that is one of the kind of complexities of dystopias. But I don't want this to drag on forever. There is, of course, so much more we can talk about, so please leave your thoughts below. I'm also just incredibly excited that I read a book that was this buzzy, that lived up to the hype. So let me know what you're thinking. Thank you, as always, for hanging out and listening to my thoughts, caring what I think at all. Like and subscribe if you're feeling it. Most importantly, read something good, and yeah, bye.